Welcome back and hello if you are new. So I hope you guys have had an absolutely fantastic week. Following what was probably their strongest release to date with Dormant Heart, Sylosis very unexpectedly went into cryostasis about 4 years ago. In a surprise announcement to fans, frontman John Middleton announced that he would then go on to a new adventure with Brighton's own architects. Now, at last, the silence has been broken and once again, Sylosis have returned and the world is their stage. One of Sylosis' strong points has always been this kind of airtight quality when it comes to their music, and Cycle of Suffering ensures that this still remains one of the focal points of the band. It should also be noted just how strong the drums are, and for good reason, as this is Ali Richardson, who's also in Bleed From Within's first performance with Sylosis actually in the studio. Drums were, for me, often the weakest link of Sylosis, but instead now they're able to kind of create these little flourishes, but also remain very much in the pocket. And most importantly, they're a bit more adventurous. You know, there's a little bit more going on rather than what was quite stagnant drum fills. And this is perfectly seen on the track Invidia, which, you know, has that fast-paced, quintessential Sylosis sound, but doesn't just sound like, you know, kind of almost like slightly slowed down D beats. Dynamics, however, are something that have always been the band's calling card, and you can see this working all the way back to Conclusion of an Age with that incredible breakdown on Terrace. It might be a slight change in palm muting or having something open, or perhaps picking up speed. I Sever is a perfect example of this. You know, the first verse has quite open chords and it's quite airy. But then when we go into the second verse, again it gets tightened up even more with that signature kind of thing that Sylosis do. You know, they change something, and it's just a small thing, but it's enough to get you into the next section, but also kind of build the tension. However, I've got to say, one of the most attractive points for me personally has always been Sylosis' Modesty. And by Modesty, what I mean is, particularly when it comes to lead guitar and things like that, is that the band have never really been overly showy. And I think that's such a cool thing, that you can see that obviously Josh Middleton is a very accomplished guitarist, and instead there's often just these little pockets of really fast technicality but also really great melody at the same time. And this is particularly seen on Apex of Disdain, which has those beautiful kind of, you know, like edge of the earth style sweeps. Of course, however, there are some influences which do kind of creep through on the record. Namely, for me, it was kind of Death's Symbolic, as I know Josh is a big fan of Death, and particularly Symbolic as an album. But you can hear these kind of like, you know, those really big riffs that are on like Zero Tolerance or Empty Words. There will be But instead of sounding like a mishmash of all these different bands that I've put together, instead it sounds like a cohesive record that takes influences for sure, but allows itself to be Sylosis. Fans also shouldn't fear that Middleton's time in Architects has diluted the band's sound either. There are sections perhaps where it's a little bit evident though, for example on Devils in Their Eyes or Disintegrate, which kind of has, I don't know, there's a certain quality to it that I could hear on Holy Hell, but again, you know, that's kind of a compromise of both Architects and Middleton's songwriting. This isn't a negative, and if anything, it's fantastic to see both bands kind of coming together and bringing a new experimentation to Sylosis' sound. Arms Like a Noose, as I kind of previously mentioned, definitely calls back to that glistening cleans that we saw on Dormant Heart. And it's cool because you can kind of have a bit of a throwback, and sets you into kind of, okay, this is what I know of Sylosis, but then changes things with the experimentation as well. Now, despite Sylosis having an incredibly tight sound, I think one of the great things about Cycle of Suffering is the production, because the production doesn't sound overly compressed or sterile. You know, instead the instruments have this quite warm quality to them, and I think that really does add to the overall vibe for the record. And again, the levels work incredibly well at the same time. Having previously seen somewhat experimental kind of touches on Dormant Heart, I thought they were going to kind of go a little bit more progressive, and Cycle of Suffering is very much a quite, you know, straightforward approach, but there are fantastic sections of experimentation. For example, on I Sever, Invidia and Abandon, all three of these tracks contain piano, and it is very subtle experimentation, but experimentation nonetheless that creates even more of a cinematic scope. There are, of course, other melodies at work behind the veil of riffs that kind of Sylosis put forward, particularly on Empty Prophets. And like I said, you know, it is that kind of combination of building these up to create an overall bigger sound. Cycle of Suffering offers glimpses into Sylosis' past whilst charging fearlessly ahead into the future. And it makes Sylosis credibly relevant after what was quite a long time away. And it may not necessarily be a masterpiece, but it's an incredibly strong effort to come back to the floor with. So, Sylosis' brand new album, Cycle of Suffering, is set for a February 7th release via Nuclear Blast Records, and you can pick it up right underneath me. I hope you guys enjoyed this album review. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button. Be sure to check out all my other videos. I've got some really cool interviews coming up. I don't know if you guys have been seeing on my Instagram, but I usually kind of post stories about them and things like that. So make sure you tune in, and I'll see you guys next week for another album review. Alright, take care, friends.